Random House Audio presents To Have and to Hold by Jane Green. Read for you by Elizabeth Sastre. This is a story about Alice Chambers, who moved into a house that once belonged to the writer Rachel Danbury, and who, in doing so, discovered something about herself, her marriage, and her capacity for love, who changed her life. Rachel Danbury was a writer who moved to the town of Highfield in the late 1930s, long after Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald spent a summer in the neighbouring town of Westport. Rachel was part of a thriving artistic community of ex-Manhattanites who had escaped to the suburbs and beyond, looking for a more relaxed, peaceful way of living. She wrote 2 novels that disappeared without trace, but her third, The Winding Road, caused a huge scandal, a scandal that ultimately forced her to move away from the town she loved, to a place where nobody would know who she was. For Rachel Danbury wrote about her life. She wrote about her marriage, about her womanizing husband Jefferson, and about her love for a man named Edward Rutherford. She wrote about a small town in Connecticut called Highfield, about the people who lived there, the people who considered themselves friends. She exposed the town and its inhabitants with warmth and humour, but with dangerously sharp accuracy, and they never forgave her for the betrayal. Rachel Danbury tried to ignore her husband's infidelities. She told herself he was simply possessed of extraordinary charm, but when he had an affair with a woman called Candace Carter, a former starlet for Paramount and owner of the town theatre, she could no longer pretend she didn't know what was going on. Rachel sought solace and revenge in the arms of Edward Rutherford, a neighbour who had always been pleasant, had always been willing to stop for a chat, and, until Rachel set out to successfully seduce him, nothing more. But Rachel and Edward fell in love, and eventually Rachel had to make a choice between a love that was more meaningful than anything she'd ever known and her husband. She chose her husband. And for the rest of her life, Rachel learned to turn a blind eye. She learned to switch off the light in her bedroom, trying not to think of the fact that her husband was not lying beside her, trying not to think about where he was or whom he might be with. The story of Rachel and Jefferson became famous in America in the 1940s. Everyone in Highfield knew the people involved, and for years the house in which Rachel and Jefferson lived, even after Rachel sold it, was thought to have a curse. Does history repeat itself? The cottage changed hands several times, and then Alice Chambers and her philandering husband Joe moved in. And this is where Alice's story starts. December 24th, 1996. Alice takes a deep breath as she opens the closet door and pulls out her dress. She lays it carefully on the bed, gathering her shoes, her veil, her stockings and garter, draping them gently next to the dress, amazed that in just a few hours' time she will be wearing all of this. In just a few hours' time she will be Joe's bride. "Here comes the bride," she sings to herself, taking small gliding steps down her hallway into the kitchen, smiling despite the butterflies, putting on the kettle to make herself another cup of coffee. She's waiting for Emily, her maid of honour, to arrive, someone with whom she can share the excitement. Walking back into the bedroom, she stands for a while gazing at the dress. While not exactly what she would have chosen, she can't deny its beauty, how elegant it is, how impossibly stylish. Alice had always thought she would have a country wedding. She dreamed, even as a little girl, of a small stone church, of walking through a white wooden gate in a soft, feminine puff of a dress, fresh flowers in her hair, and a bouquet of hand-picked wild daisies in her hand. The groom had been unimportant. Her fantasy had ended at the church door. But she knows the groom, even in her fantasies, would never have been as handsome or as successful as Joe. At university, when she and Emily sat up late into the night discussing their knights in shining armour, Alice said she thought her ideal man would probably be an artist, or a craftsman, or a gardener. She had laughed as she said it, laughed at the unlikeliness of any lasting relationship, let alone marriage, given that her longest relationship at that time had been 3 weeks. And before meeting Joe, her longest relationship had been 3 months. Not a good record. She'd grown to Emily when they were both planning on growing old together. "Means nothing," Emily had reassured. "Once you find him, you'll be married for life. Me, I'll probably get divorced after 6 months. Alice had laughed, but she wished she could be more like Emily, who didn't want to settle down, who was quite happy flirting and flitting from one boy to the next, who claimed to have been born with a fatal allergy to commitment. When Jo proposed, she had told him about her dream wedding, and he had said it was a lovely fantasy, but they couldn't possibly get married in the country when both of them lived in London. And anyway, didn't she agree that winter weddings were so much smarter? She didn't agree, but felt she had to, because after all, Jo was paying for it. Alice's parents didn't have a penny, and Jo was determined to have a wedding that he judged fitting for the head of the healthcare business in mergers and acquisitions at Godfrey Hamilton Salts. Alice drains her coffee and steals a quick glance in the hall mirror to confirm what she already knows. Deep bags under her eyes, proving that last-minute nerves are not just an old wives' tale. She has spent the night tossing and turning, fear rising up in a wave of nausea, common sense trying to push it back down again. After all, isn't she the luckiest girl in the world? What woman would not want to marry Jo? Jo, who could have married anyone he wanted, and he chose Alice. Alice! Alice has always thought of herself as rather plain. Everyone who knows Alice has always thought of her as rather plain. She was the shy girl in the playground, who was always last to be picked for teams because no one ever seemed to notice her. At 14, she had become known as wallpaper, although frankly it never bothered her. She quite liked the fact that she faded into the background, that she could watch her classmates and think her thoughts without anyone ever bothering her. It only started to bother her when she discovered boys. One morning the girls of Lower Fourth awoke to find hormones raging through their developing bodies, and Alice found herself dreaming of faded jeans and a cute smile that belonged to a boy named Joe at the boys' school round the corner. She had known Joe for years. He had been a friend of Ty's, her older brother, at school. She remembered watching him chat up the prettiest girl in her school at a local disco, watched him laugh and smile with her, his face moving closer and closer as he leaned in for a kiss, before taking her hand and leading her out the door. Rumour had it that he had gone back to her house, kissed her good-night, then an hour later shinned up the drainpipe and stolen her virginity. It was the stuff of which legends were made, and Jo was, even then, a legend. And then one day the doorbell rang, and Alice ran to answer it, nearly fainting when she discovered Jo standing on the doorstep. A hot flush crept up her cheeks, staining them scarlet. "Hello, Ty's sister," he smiled, his voice low and flirtatious. "You look lovely. Are you going somewhere nice?" It amused him to see her blush further, and still more to see she had quite literally lost the power of speech. Alice managed to mumble something and stumbled away when Ty appeared. She had called Emily immediately, and Emily had come round to analyse, inspect and dissect every word. They had locked themselves in Alice's bedroom, each slumped on a beanbag, squealing with excitement as they went over and over the few words he had uttered, trying to understand what they meant. "Say it again," Emily pleaded. "Tell me again what he sounded like when he said, 'You look lovely.'" They formulated a plan of action, worked out exactly what Alice would say to Jo when she next saw him, what tone of voice she would use, what she would wear when he took her out, because clearly he was interested. Jo never noticed Alice again. 14 years later, Alice had a thriving catering business. She had finally managed to get over Jo and pass 6.0 and 2 A-levels, had gone to catering college, and from there to a year-long cooking course. At 29 years old, she had an occasional staff of 3 who helped her prepare and serve gourmet dinners for women too busy, or too lazy, to cook. Alice tended to stay in the background at these dinner parties. She loved cooking the meals beforehand, but stayed in the kitchen making sure nothing got burned while the other girls served canapés and cocktails. Occasionally, should the host or hostess demand, she would come in to receive praise, reluctantly but graciously, smoothing back the loose curls that had escaped her ponytail as she handed out business cards. She had a small flat with a large kitchen in Kensal Rise, her 2 cats, Molly and Paolo, and a tiny social life thanks in part to the success of her business and in part to her natural shyness. So there she was, in the kitchen of her dreams, in the basement of a large house in Primrose Hill. The guests were drinking espresso, with homemade petit fours, and Alice said goodbye to the 2 girls helping her out, knowing that the only thing left to do would be to wash up the coffee cups, and she could manage that perfectly well by herself. "Oh, you must meet Alice," She heard the hostess banging down the stairs.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?